Now that the New Orleans Saints 53-man roster is set, which position groups should you be the most confident about, and which ones still need a little bit of work? We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, to all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can always subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you want to keep the conversation going one-on-one with me, that includes our exclusive film studies, early access, inside information, Q&As, and much more, you can head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints to join a community that I would love for you to be a part of. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on your favorite social media, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media. You can find me as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints. You can also find me every Tuesday on the Locked On NFL podcast and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs is the number one place to post your jobs because they're going to help you find your qualified candidates faster and for free. Visit linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free today. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're officially under waiver watch. We'll talk about the times of the day you should be aware of today, when waivers release, when players can start to be signed to practice squads, when players can go to injured reserve. We'll lay out the whole calendar for you. And of course, highlight the big players that we're going to be watching from the New Orleans Saints, including, of course, wide receiver Shaq Davis. We're going to take a look at our prove it and improve it lines. Who are the position groups that can need to prove it in 2023? And who are the position groups that need to improve it going into 2023 based on the 2022 performance? But first, I want to start off with the strongest and maybe weakest units or groups so far going into this 2023 season, now that the 53-man roster, initial 53-man roster, is set. So we'll start off with the strongest unit here. And I had a really hard time picking this because, look, there's a lot of options, right? The tight end unit is really good. The pass catcher group as a whole is very good. But I'm going to go with the defensive backs. And this is the same as where the Saints were last year. This shouldn't be very surprising. Think about the top of this all, right? Before we even get to the players, think about the coaches. Dennis Allen, Joe Woods, Marcus Robertson, all of these guys, hardcore secondary guys. They want their defensive backs to be good. They want to build their defense on the identity of their DBs while also winning in the pass rush. Don't get me wrong, but we'll get to the defensive line later. But where we see the Saints right now with this defensive backs group is really, really impressive. I don't know that they have the means to be able to make up for the departure of Bradley Roby just yet. Not based on player, not based on talent, not based on can you put the body in the place. They have the body to put in the slot after the departure of Bradley Roby. But do those players have enough experience in the slot? And will the learning curve be too steep, right? Will that end up being too tough for a guy like Alontae Taylor being thrown into week one action as the starting slot cornerback? We'll see. He's got to sink or swim. He swam when he had to jump in place of Marshon Lattimore. But the big difference there is that in place of Marshon Lattimore, he's played on the outside his entire career. He played only 16 snaps in the slot during the entire preseason, played 9 snaps in the slot last year, and a lot of those are ones that he got motioned into, played 23 snaps in the slot when it came to his collegiate career, according to Pro Football Focus as well. So there's a lot to kind of figure out here, don't get me wrong, but whatever the case may be, and these are passing snaps, coverage snaps in the slot, but whatever the case may be, he's incredibly talented, and he's one of those guys where when it does click, it's going to click big time. So Marshon Lattimore, Adebo, Alontae Taylor is your starting corners. You've got Tyrann Mathieu and Marcus Maye as your starting safeties. Behind them, you've got Isaac Yiadom, a guy that has looked fantastic over the course of the preseason as well as training camp, who can help you on special teams, but can also help you out as a corner. Ugo Amadi is a guy that can play slot corner, split safety, deep safety, play down in the box. Jordan Howden, the exact same thing. You have Lonnie Johnson Jr., who can play a bunch of different roles, and then JT Gray, who's your special teams ace and one of your top backup safeties as well. This is a very, very strong collection of 10 defensive backs. Now, JT Gray did get hurt, shoulder injury, during the final preseason game against the Houston Texans. We'll have to wait and see how serious that is, if serious at all. So something to watch out for as we get to the kind of IR designation, which we'll highlight a little bit later today. But if he's all good, this group of 10 defensive backs is really, really strong. And I think the strongest unit on the New Orleans Saints roster, although tight end was a very, very close second. To me, the weakest, and when I say weakest, what I mean is position group that still has to be maybe tinkered with, still needs to be improved a bit, is the offensive line. And look, if you're an everydayer, you've heard me harping on this over and over and over and over again, but you've got a solid starting five in pinning. I assume James Hurst over Andrus Peat, Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, Ryan Ramczyk, but then the depth of Andrus Peat, Nick Saldiveri, Max Garcia, and Landon Young is a little shaky. Andrus Peat struggled big time against the Houston Texans. I know, though, that it was his first action back in for however many months since he's played, since he hasn't played. Nick Saldiveri's had some growing pains, but has looked good. Max Garcia's been solid, but Landon Young's been dealing with injury and things like that. And they have been cross-training Landon Young, not just at tackle, but also at guard, and he's had some growing pains there as well. So this might be a position to where I can see the Saints, if the right veteran makes it through, doesn't land on a practice squad somewhere, or the right young player makes it through waivers later on today, that they could potentially add to this unit. Now, them adding to this unit does not necessarily mean adding to the 53-man roster. It could mean adding veterans, adding players, young, talented players to their practice squad that they could then elevate on game days so that they could get a look at these players kind of on a trial basis almost before potentially adding them to the 53-man roster. Remember, a player on your practice squad can be elevated 3 times and for 3 weeks, 3 different games for your game day roster before they have to be added to your active roster or let go. So the Saints would have a lot of opportunity to get 3 games worth of tape on some of these players if they really felt that they needed to. Ideally, the Saints don't have to get to the shaky part of their offensive line. Ideally, your entire offensive line plays all 7 games, but we know how that goes. That does not happen in the NFL. A lot of micro hits, a lot of jammed fingers, a lot of toes, a lot of impact injuries, a lot of soft tissue injuries, things like that can happen in the trenches. So you have to build up a depth or a collection of depth that's going to be able to keep you afloat in games. Think back to 2017, 18, 19, how much we saw the New Orleans Saints able to do that. We've seen that kind of taper off since then because of the COVID cuts and all these other things where the middle of the roster got gutted, and the Saints have been very, I would say with intent, very intentionally rebuilding that depth over the course of the past couple of years. I think they did a good job of it this year, but still a little shaky and maybe a place where you can continue to tinker. So when I say that it's weak, I don't mean that it's something that the Saints need to like throw the whole playbook out and start all over again, but they're certainly, particularly when it comes to the depth at that position group, still looking to kind of muddle some things around and potentially see if they can find some other players to mix in there, whether it's on the 53-man roster or via the practice squad. So those are the units that I would say are the strongest and the weakest. But what are the position groups that need to prove something coming into 2023, or maybe need to improve something coming into 2023? We got those coming up for you here as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. You probably use LinkedIn looking for jobs, but did you know that if you're hiring, you can also use LinkedIn Jobs to post and hire candidates as well? In fact, a lot of small businesses have voted LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading candidates. So not only can you, but you should. You should use LinkedIn Jobs for exactly this, because you want to be 100% certain that you have the access to the information that you need for the most qualified candidates that are available. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs is perfect. They give you access to small, easy to use screening tools like screening questions and things like that to make sure that you're able to kind of filter out and easily focus on the candidates that have the right skills and experience so that you can quickly prioritize the folks that you want to interview and eventually hire. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster, and you can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. We looked at the strongest and the weakest units on the New Orleans Saints 53-man roster so far, right? The initial 53. Let's take a look at those that need to prove it and the ones that maybe need to improve it a little bit based on their 2022 performance going in here to 2023. Appreciate you as always. So all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can find us everywhere, and wherever you're getting this, there's getting more and more episodes, and there'll be another episode later on today, as well as we look at the practice squad and breaking down who was added, all that good stuff. So what I want to start off looking at today, or not start off, but what I want to get to now is the group that needs to prove something, right? And so I'm going to go with the defensive line group here. The defensive line group, I think, has a lot of pressure to prove something, not because we should be doubting it, or not because anyone is doubting it. It's just that it is the group that, I mean, over all of these groups that has had the most turnover, right? We're looking at 9 defensive linemen that are here. Cam Jordan, Carl Granderson over on the edge, backed up by Isaiah Foskey, Tano Passanio, and Peyton Turner. And you've got Khalen Saunders, Nathan Shepard on the interior, backed up by Bryan Bresee and Malcolm Roach. Now, what we know about the New Orleans Saints defensive line is that backing up means you probably just take fewer snaps than the other guys, but you get a lot of snaps. So no matter what, this group of 9 players is going to play a ton. But if you really think about it, Cam Jordan, Carl Granderson, Peyton Turner, Tano Passanio, and Malcolm Roach are the only returning 5 of that 9. So nearly half of this unit is new. Khalen Saunders, Nathan Shepard, Isaiah Foskey, and Bryan Bresee, of course, is the 2 draft picks. So this is a unit that has a lot to prove, and not because I'm doubting it. In fact, I think that this group is, from what we have seen so far during training camp in the preseason, better than it was last year. Remember, this was a group that finished top 5 when it came to sacks, but was near the bottom of the NFL when it came to pressures, when it came to QB hits, was 24th in the NFL when it came to run defense. These are all things that should get better. And so this is a spot that needs to prove it. The New Orleans Saints made a lot of tough decisions this offseason, not necessarily letting, but watching David Onyemata walk, watching Shy Tuttle walk, watching Kentavious Street walk, watching Marcus Davenport walk. And some of those might not have been tough players to let walk. Like, let's be honest here, right? But they are players that knew the system. They are players that fit comfortably in the system. They are players that helped to make other players around them better, because Cam Jordan was used to playing next to David Onyemata. Peyton Turner was developing right alongside Marcus Davenport, playing next to guys like Shy Tuttle, David Onyemata, Kentavious Street, so on and so forth. Kentavious Street was a great free agency addition for the New Orleans Saints last year and got better and better as the year went on. So I think when you look at this defensive line unit, what you're looking at in terms of them needing to prove it is that, did the New Orleans Saints make the right decisions here? Should they have gone and paid even more for a David Onyemata, paid to keep Shy Tuttle? Should they have went out there and really, really worked to keep Marcus Davenport in New Orleans? I don't think so. Should the New Orleans Saints have picked up the 5th-year option on Marcus Davenport? That's another big question, right? To where they had him, they wouldn't have had him last year. There's a lot of different things that you look at going into this season that you say, okay, there's a lot of turnover, there's new faces, there's a lot of departures. Can this unit prove that the Saints made the right decisions, and can this unit prove that they're better this year than they were last year? And that's the other thing you're trying to prove too if you're the New Orleans Saints. Not only did you make the right decision by not trying to outbid more, right, trying to win, or by winning those bidding wars that could have developed over some of your departing defensive linemen, but did you make the right decisions in terms of bringing the right faces in? Because you've got 2 free agency additions in Khalen Saunders and Nathan Shepard. And then you've effectively completely overhauled your defensive tackle room because you lost 3 players. You're replacing 3 players and bringing back only 1 player in Malcolm Roach, who's my breakout candidate for this season. And then you draft Bryan Bresee. So you've got 2 big free agency acquisitions and a draft pick that you need to be able to say, we made the right choice. That's a big prove it moment. I'm confident in this group. I'm very, very confident in this group, but they are a prove it group. I'm just confident that they will prove it. The improve it group, maybe I'm taking it in an interesting direction here. So this is a group that needs to prove something, but what they need to prove is that they've improved from last year. And I thought about going quarterback here, But I thought that would be too easy, right? You had the injury to Jameis Winston. You spent 14 games with Andy Dalton. What was your ceiling really in that case? So I went away from that. I thought about maybe going running back as one that could be there, right? You're trying to improve from where you were last year. Probably would have been a good choice if I'm being honest. It's a free agency acquisition. It's a draft pick, all that. But let me stop rambling and just tell you what I chose. I chose wide receiver. I think that there's a couple different things that you need to prove that you've improved when it comes to this position group. Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed are already improvements. Okay, they're already improvements. So check that box, right? You're on a good start, New Orleans. Because I'm looking at not only 2022 in that case, I'm looking at 2021. But even early in 2022, Chris Olave was still grasping the playbook, still learning the system, still learning how to operate in effect. There didn't become the number one guy until 3 weeks into the season. Rashid Shaheed wasn't with the team all throughout training camp. And then when he was finally activated and brought up after the Deontay Hardy injury, he was a guy that, was still grasping the playbook and that they could only plug into these kind of smaller moments. And then you watch that grow more and more throughout the season where you saw him reeling in 4 or 5 catches a game, right? Now going into 2023, both these guys have a year in the system. They have a year in the system now together. They've played an off season together, although Rashid Shaheed's been dealing with some injury. Chris Olave's had on and off injuries, but nothing that's really kept him completely out, like what we saw with Shaheed. But there's a lot of confidence in these two players, and there should be. There should be a ton of confidence in these players. And so when I look at Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, you're looking at the improvement from 2022 into 2023, which is all good news. All good news. Michael Thomas is the other one, because not only are you trying to show that you've improved, that these young players have improved as players, but now you've got to be able to show, if you're Michael Thomas, that he has improved when it comes to health. And that becomes the biggest improvement that this entire roster will need to show in 2023 is, can you stay healthy? That's not just a Michael Thomas thing. That's an offensive line thing. That's a defensive line thing. That's a fellow wide receiver thing. That's a quarterback thing. Like, there's so many different pieces to that. That's a running back thing, so on and so forth. But Michael Thomas has to be able to show that he has improved in terms of his health. Kat Terrell did a phenomenal piece over at ESPN highlighting exactly why the surgeries didn't work for Michael Thomas and why he's healthy now as opposed to being healthy at any point over the course of the past 3 years. And it outlines some of the things that he struggled with and why it's there and why things are different now. Gives you the reasons. Now you have to see the product, right? Are things actually different now? And then you have to look at the depth. Did you improve the depth behind the players that could potentially be injured? This was a big question for us going into the season. What happens if you lose somebody for a game, for a snap, for a drive, for a half, whatever it might be? What happens if you lose somebody out of that top 3? Do you have the talent to be able to pick up and clean up after that and still find players that are going to be able to contribute? Now, we have to see what the practice squad is going to look like, because the practice squad would play a big role in that. So you have the players to be able to maintain the additional roles, but what about at wide receiver? And so that's where players like Keith Kirkwood, who has looked really sharp over the course of this preseason, a young player in A.T. Perry who has so much potential. And then we'll see what happens with the Traquan Smith, Shaq Davis conversation and all that, and what happens with Traquan Smith's roster number if he gets moved to injured reserve later on today. So lots of different things that the New Orleans Saints can still shuffle around here, but there's a lot that this unit needs to show that they have improved going into 2023 and 2022. Do you have the confidence in it? That's a whole other conversation. I have the confidence when it comes to the defensive line. I have the confidence when it comes to the top of the wide receiver room. My biggest question is, can you make up for any absences should you need to? And I like guys like A.T. Perry and Keith Kirkwood a lot, but can they step into those roles and still allow your offense to be able to maintain at a high level? And certainly having big pass catching tight ends like Juwan Johnson, Foster Moreau, and Jimmy Graham, who I needed to make sure that I included in this conversation, and then Taysom Hill, who can play anywhere and everywhere, helps you with all of those questions, concerns as well, because you're not just looking at the wide receiver room, you're looking at the pass catching unit as a whole. So we'll see. We'll see where the New Orleans Saints are there. Coming up next, waiver watch is underway. What time do the waivers release? What time does the practice squad start up? What time can players be moved to injured reserve? We got all that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints, bringing you the updates that you need about what to watch for throughout the rest of today Wednesday when it comes to the roster building that's going to be going on across the entire NFL. Appreciate you as always to all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Hope you've been enjoying the shows here. I've been having a lot of fun. I feel like we've been getting through some really informative stuff. So here's some more for you so that you know what to expect today. So across the NFL, rosters needed to be cut down to their 53-man roster by 4 p.m. Eastern time, or New York time, as the NFL likes to say. Today, Tuesday, the players that were waived, which remember, those are the ones that are subject to waivers, players that were released have already been able to do whatever they wanted to do. And you've already seen several players that were released signing to 53-man rosters, announcement that they intend to be added to practice squads, things like that. I'll explain why it's an intended to be added as opposed to actually being added here in just a second. But those players that were set up for waivers, those waivers will clear at 11 a.m. Central Time, noon Eastern Time, okay? New York time. So what that means is that you're going to see a whole bunch of reports about this team was awarded this player on waivers. This team was awarded this player on waivers. Waivers work the same way that you would imagine like your waiver priority in a fantasy football team working, right? Whoever had you kind of looking in draft order, whoever had the number one overall selection or finished in place where their original pick would have been the number one overall selection. So not the Carolina Panthers, but the Chicago Bears will have number one waiver priority when it comes to exactly this. The New Orleans Saints finished 10th because that is where their that's where their original draft pick was. The Saints are in the top 10 when it comes to waiver priority, upper third. So it's good news if they wanted to claim anybody else that's off of waivers and things like that. So you'll want to watch out for that. Now, beyond that, an hour later is when teams can start to assemble their practice squads, right? So you're going to hear a lot of reports that are saying even earlier than that teams intend to add or are expected to add X player to their practice squad, stuff like that. But then those things won't become official until it'll be noon Eastern time, 1 p.m. Central time. Or excuse me, flip that. Noon Central time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. My apologies. So at that point, you'll start to see the practice squad start to build up. So let's pause there, and I'll tell you about IR here in just a second. But we'll pause there and take a look at some of the players that you're obviously going to be paying the most attention to when it comes to 11 a.m. Central Time and noon Central Time for first waivers to clear, second practice squads to start being assembled, if you will. Fan favorites like Shaq Davis, Jontre Kirklin, Smoke Monday, Niko Lalos, Lucas Kroll, so on and so forth. We'll start with those five. Those are player names that you're going to be waiting to hear at 11 a.m. Central Time that they cleared waivers, okay? That's what you're hoping for, is that those players clear waivers and don't end up being picked up by some other team on their 53-man roster. And this is why a lot of us have a lot of confidence in players clearing waivers, is because you don't get picked up off of waivers to land on a practice squad. You get picked up off of waivers to be added to a 53-man roster. That's the purpose of waivers. If you claim somebody, if the Bears claim Shaq Davis, they have to add him to their 53-man roster. It's not all right, we're claiming you and then we're moving you to the practice squad. They could claim him, put him on the active roster, and then waive him again, hope that he passes through waivers kind of quietly, and then add him to their practice squad. But you can't go directly from waivers to a practice squad. The other players that I'm particularly interested in, Jonathan Abram, Lynn Bowden Jr., Jerron Cage, Mark Evans as well. The Saints can have 6 veteran players out of 16 practice squad players. So a lot of these guys on waivers, you got 10 spots that are guaranteed to be young players, but they could go more than 10 spots. You just can't go more than 6 veterans. Some of those veterans that are already out there that you would be waiting to hear at that second time at noon Central Time, waiting to see what's going to happen with maybe a JP Holtz, with maybe a Bradley Roby, with maybe a Darrell Williams, a Ty Summers, a Ryan Conley, these guys that can be added as veterans to your practice squad. But there are also players that have been released all over the NFL that can be added to your practice squad as well, and can also be claimed off of waivers and added to the Saints' 53-man active roster. So if they wanted to tinker with the offensive line, like I was talking about before, waivers and a 10th waiver priority ranking could give them the opportunity to do exactly that. So that's what you're waiting for. You're waiting to hear if those names clear waivers, and then an hour later if they're going to be added to the practice squad. So that's what you're looking for later on today, or very soon today. And we'll have another episode up later on this afternoon. Our second show today will be about here's the practice squad. Here's the players we think could potentially have, be elevated and impact and contribute and all those other things, as well as any other big moves that happen today. One of the other big moves that could happen today begins at 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, which is that players can be moved to injured reserve without ending their season. So this is where those procedural moves that we've been talking about, where we warned and said, hey, there might be some veteran names that get released that feel kind of shocking, but wait, because it's the first, it's not to be viewed in a vacuum. It could be the first of a couple of different moves. The Bradley Roby one feels like it's in a vacuum, right? His goodbye message, all those other things feel very, there's a finality to that feels very real. But Jaylon Smith was on Twitter celebrating, kind of, clearly was in good vibes, and then was released by the New Orleans Saints. And then has kind of been on the hush hush after that. So maybe, just maybe, there's kind of that handshake agreement that we see all around the NFL all the time of like, hey, we want to move this player to injured reserve, so we're going to keep him on the roster. We're going to release you, but stay by your phone. Don't go anywhere. Don't accept any contracts. We're bringing you back. And the Saints could go that route with a Jaylon Smith by moving a Traquan Smith to injured reserve. They could go that route with Landon Young by moving Landon Young to injured reserve. JT Gray could be in that conversation depending on the severity of his injury if that is required. So there's still a lot more moves that can happen by the end of today that make the initial 53-man roster almost entirely different in terms of its outlook less than or just 24 hours later. So that's going to be one to watch. Probably not tonight specifically, but know that begins this afternoon. That you can take a player moved into injured reserve. They only have to miss the first 4 games of the season. That's up from 3. You have to miss the first 4. You have to miss at least 4 games when you go on injured reserve now. So that could happen as early as 3 p.m. Central Time or sometime this evening. Could also happen tomorrow. Dennis Allen made a comment that, look, the idea of Jaylon Smith returning is not at all, like there's absolutely still the opportunity of that. This could be the way that happens. And that could happen now. That could happen tomorrow. That can happen this weekend. It could happen early next week. But that period in which you can start to move players to injured reserve without ending their season begins at 3 p.m. Central Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time today. All right, coming up later on today, going to have another episode for you where we're looking at the 16-man practice squad, as well as any other moves that might break down. We're going to focus on the practice squad. Who are the players that could potentially be elevated throughout the season, and particularly early in the season, that could have an impact for the New Orleans Saints on offense, defense, and special teams. Got that coming up for you later on today, and I appreciate you as always, all you everydayers out there, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day, for making me a part of your day, a part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi, and if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.